from our case, when we had the diagnosis of our son all those years ago, he was one case of it had only been he was the seventh case of that diagnosis in Australia's history. So so there wasn't really people that knew enough detail about it, and even the specialist we went to said, well, he might sit. It was if you're going to ever knock someone to the floor, that was the advice we got, and that was devastating. And then so it's really hard when you go to professionals. You expect a level of communication and emotional intelligence that goes with that, and it's not always the case. I mean, people have varying levels of emotional intelligence in all roles and in all industries that we have such a smattering and a range of people's capabilities in that space. It's incredible. So buyer beware, I think, when you're dealing with dealing with him. And I think there's some self-protection that goes with that you end up not talking about it because you talked with a couple and you got heard about it at the time. So it's intriguing. But yeah, it's a tough industry, I think, Clive, that you're in, and there's a lot of emotional intelligence that goes with being good in that field, like anywhere. But
yeah. Well, one thing I learned very quickly, Jeff, was, and back to Rob's point, was meeting people where they are and understanding the language. This was especially true of males, and especially true of males with depression. And again, our training is to help people uncover their thoughts and their feelings and make sense of it and put them on a better path. Sometimes with males, and we're talking about the macho industries before, Rob mentioned mining, and I would concur with that, but also say rural males out here in Australia, for example, guys are used to a very different culture, and to talk to those guys about feelings, well, kind of forget it for a while until you've built up sufficient levels of trust. And there's a wonderful lady in Australia, her name's Mary O'Brien, not a psychologist, but she was devastated by the suicide rate in rural Australia amongst the males. And she started, she asked people to send in photographs of their heavy machinery, these farming guys, that were bogged in mud. She said, send them in. And she started this movement called Are You Bogged, Mate? In other words, she used the very similar language. When your truck is bogged, you can continue to spin your wheels, getting nowhere, and eventually, what happens with that? Well, you blow the engine up, or you can actually resign yourself to the fact that you need some help here. You might need some people to dig the wheels out, or somebody to give you a tow out and so forth. Look, her language is brilliant. She said it's no different in our lives. Sometimes
I love that analogy. I reckon it's great.
It's brilliant. We get bogged. And if we're bogged, again, you can spin your own wheels and sometimes you get nowhere at all, or you can actually reach out and just understand that as guys, sometimes we get bogged. And when you get bogged, now's the good time to reach out. So it's partly, for me, it's about recognizing, I would love it to change where we start giving young males different messages about what it means to show vulnerability, but that's the long haul, right? That's not going to change right now, but we need to start on that. In the meantime, we need to meet guys where they are now with their thinking, with their language, and just really get them started on, what, sometimes when you're bogged, you need a tow. And I thoroughly recommend people look Mary O'Brien up. Just go to, I think it's, I wrote it down somewhere. areyouboggedmates.com.
Put it in the chat if you can, Clive.
Yeah, great idea.
And we'll get hopefully get this out to people. So I think that's fantastic. I really love that analogy. It's incredible. Rob, Greg, any comments on that?
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking as Clive was talking there, and how you sort of outlined that the element of a specific industry model, right? Because it's talking directly, specifically to the individuals within that sector, and that's where I've seen mates in construction being so effective, and construction being a significantly challenged area in terms of suicide. Certainly in New Zealand, you are 5 times more likely to commit suicide than to have a workplace accident, to die from a workplace accident, I should say. And that's a shocking statistic, and it shouldn't be that way. So mates in construction, which has been going, I think, for 13 years in Australia, has had some significant impact on the suicide rate, and it started in New Zealand now as well. So in August of last year, we began Mates in Construction in New Zealand, and the beauty of that is it's inducting workers and training people within the industry to be the people who are best able to talk to the industry itself. So that's one area, but another area is in aviation. And aviation is a really challenging space because from a safety perspective, you want your pilots to be in tip-top shape. But the challenge for a pilot is the moment that you reveal anything untoward, that you are having, you're undergoing depression or you're not in a good psychological space, that can severely limit your career prospects. So in New Zealand, they have the Airline Pilots Association have started an organization called PAN, which is the Peer Assistance Network. And that is pilots who are trained in that first line ability to talk to people. It's anonymous, and you're able to call in as a pilot to be able to say, hey, I'm experiencing this. And you're able to then have a non-threatening, non-judgmental way of being able to release yourself from that process of spinning the wheels. So these initiatives are fantastic. And I think more organizations, it's not just an employee sort of action program. It's specifically designed from a mental health and suicide prevention perspective.
Yeah, fantastic. Rob, anything to add?
No, I love it, Greg, actually. And you know, you brought up something in there. It's like people have the lingo and they're using it in industry, right? And that's where I've really put myself out in my industry. Like my audience is manufacturing, oil and gas, mining, and I've started talking about it on my show. And the reason I do that, and you know, like we talked about vulnerability. When I put out the first podcast, I actually had an anxiety attack at my desk, and I ended up in the doctor's office on some benzodiazepines for a week. And, you know, like I kind of thought like, you know, hey, like everyone's going to reject me. They're going to think like, hey, this guy, you know, high achiever, but he doesn't feel good. So how would we feel, you know? And actually it was the opposite, you know, like I know, Jeff, you sent me a message early on. I got messages basically from Australia to Canada, the United States, UK, wherever they're listeners, and people shared their own stories. And I think for me, that sort of pushed me to continue doing it, because now I'm seeing like, hey, you know, if I can be this guy, which, you know, my audience is not that big, but if I can be this guy and I can help one person, it's all worthwhile for me.
I think you're being a bit modest there, Rob, about your audience not being that big. But I'd have to say, when I because I keep up with your stuff on LinkedIn and your podcasts, and when I listened to that particular podcast, I was blown away at how raw it really was, and how vulnerable you had put that in the state you were in. You put that out, and I thought, you know, well, badge of honor, this, you know, and I've got my own demons, and I'm sure lots of others have, but I thought this needs to be talked about. It was one of the sparks for me when I reached out to you that that this event actually happened. So, you know, I take my hat off to you that you did, and I hope that some of the people in your network have learnt to talk about it and deal with it better as a result of what you've done. You should be proud of yourself.
I mean, I appreciate it. And I guess the other thing I wanted to talk about, I know, Clive, we talked about, you know, finding the right therapist. And for me, like I was probably depressed, I don't know, 9, 10, 12 months before I went to the doctor. And what I've learned from medical professionals is basically they diagnose you and give you medication and send you home. And for me, I've had really horrible interactions with the medication. So like SSRIs, SNRIs, like all of them. And so if you're in a situation where you're living alone and you're basically on new medication and they're telling you, hey, you need to monitor your own mental health and come back if it gets worse, you need to find somebody to keep tabs on you, because you won't be able to do it yourself. Like I never could do that. Even as recently as a couple months ago when I was on new medication, I wasn't able to do that. But now I have a coach who's monitoring me. My girlfriend's monitoring me. But the first time I was alone, and I got to tell you, like, you have to make sure you have someone you can confide in, because otherwise you're just going to get real dark real quick.